Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review of the Harbor Freight Chief 4-inch long nose professional air die grinder. Harbor Freight's come out with this new brand Chief, which is I guess their competition to other basically professional grade of air tools. And part of Harbor Freight's new push for more expensive higher end tools. This is normally $60 on the shelf, and it's really not made too bad at all. It has a nice metal switch with a metal lockout. The lockout actually contacts the cast aluminum internal body. The whole front end has a steel cap with a steel nose. What's interesting is this cap is actually similar to this little micro grinder, which I had reviewed, where the cap really just covers up the threads of the actual spindle that keeps it totally assembled. And so that's the very same way here. And I think it's a little bit cheesy, but this cap actually doesn't provide any structure whatsoever. When you unscrew it, then you have access to two flats, then you can unscrew this barrel from the aluminum body. They use thread locker, and I'm not going to do that on this particular unit because they use a lot, and it tends to tear up the threads. And a die grinder isn't too exciting to look inside. And since I already did a tear down of this, it's quite similar. The difference with the Chief, and I might as well just reference, I kind of like the fact that even to this day, Harbor Freight still includes parts breakdowns inside their tool. And I just wanted to point out that we have, we have one ball bearing there, we have another ball bearing on the front of the air motor, and if we look at the spindle stack, we can actually see two ball bearings on the front. So what is interesting about this unit is that this spindle actually has dual ball bearings up here at the top and is very tight, and it actually makes it pretty heavy duty. On the back end, this spindle actually screws in threads into a little, protrusion off the end of the air motor itself. So that front bearing for the air motor is doing double duty because it's both supporting the air motor as well as supporting the back of the shaft. But I understand why they do that, because there's not as much force or vibration there as there is up here where you're really pushing or holding it tight when you're doing grinding operations. So I do like that they use double ball bearings, and that actually does make it pretty heavy duty. And for $60, this really isn't that bad, especially considering it does have a steel front end, even if this cap is more, the steel cap here is more for cosmetics than anything else. This is a boot that they somehow probably used a press or something to push on, that it's fairly soft, but also feels quite robust. Also, this die grinder has a rear exhaust as opposed to a front exhaust such as this die grinder. This little die grinder, even though it has two little bearings, when you oil it, the oil goes through the air motor and then blows out the front, so it gives a little bit of lubrication to the front bearing, even though it doesn't actually pass through the bearing. On this one, it goes through the air motor and then back out the exhaust. So these two bearings up here actually don't receive lube very often. So it would be recommended to actually put a couple drops of oil, every week or so, or depending on how much you use it, with it standing up so the oil can seep in and kind of get these two upper bearings, since everything that you put in this nozzle is going to end up just cycling through the air motor and coming out of the back. Otherwise, this thing is pretty nice. I like the larger grip than you do. Even though this one is tiny, this is much more comfortable. It's more of just a standard, size hand. And then with the 4-inch, it still makes it pretty compact, but allows you to use two hands with it, so you can just get dramatically more control. It does spin slower. This is only 20,000 RPM, where this little guy is 25,000 RPM. Although they use the exact same spin or collet and retention system. And they both have variable power. This one you have to use a little screwdriver. This one has a little knob. The one criticism I would say with the variable power is the full power is actually in the middle position. So if you're using this, it could be easy to bump it one direction or the other, thus reducing your power. And so that can be just a little bit annoying. Since it is a bigger die grinder, it needs 4 CFM. My air compressor is far less than that, but I'll still do a little demonstration. But it is a big grinder. You're going to want big hoses, big fittings, and a pretty high flow compressor to really be able to get the most out of this grinder. And a lot of air tools, of course, this 90 psi is the standard rating, but I advise people to really make like a little intermediate hose setup with the air gauge so they can see what the pressure drop is when they're actually running their tool. And it's surprising. A lot of people I've met run their compressors at 120, 130 psi just because that's what it takes to actually maintain 90 at the air tool while it's under use with the throttle fully open. Let's do a little grinding. Alright, here we go. I should mention that this little tool did come with a couple of just basic wrenches, just standard chrome-plated wrenches, an 11 and a 17. I do like that they at least printed the sizes on them, so it's easier to remember. And we got a little 1-inch wheel, and I'll just do a little demonstration. I have a totally inadequate compressor, but just so you can hear how it sounds when it's under a little bit of load. I really like these longer spindle ones in a lot of situations, particularly like cutoff. Just because you just have a heck of a lot more control, and then you have this nice little narrow barrel to grip onto. About all my compressor has. So anyway, that was kind of the basic review. I don't have, I used to have a lot more air tools, but I sold most of them just because I didn't have a compressor to keep up with them. And that's it's a big annoyance for me because I don't have a proper garage or shop, is dealing with that compressor. That's the big, air tools have so many advantages just because, they're running off of air, which is a clean supply, so it's always blowing out grit. You're always oiling them all the time. They're much more simple because you don't have any electrics to deal with. It's just that, relatively speaking, you just have to have these massive compressors. Even a 4 CFM compressor is a pretty hefty, well-sized compressor. But man, air tools can certainly be extremely compact for that sacrifice of having basically their power supply be remote like that. And I think this Chief is pretty nice. I was looking around and I was having a bit of a hard time, but I'm sure that this tool is sold under other names. It just seems so well made. I mean, the molding on the overmold is really tight. There's just a tiny little lip there. As far as like the fit and the finish of all the machine parts, they're all pretty darn nice. I mean, really surprising for Harbor Freight, and it's pretty competitively priced. I know like an IR is around $100 for an equivalent model. I don't think this is built as quite as well as an IR, but for Harbor Freight, for $60, this is like just so much better than any of the other die grinders that they've had. It's really pretty surprising. This thing is really pretty well made. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.